Well, good morning, brethren. It's happy Sabbath to you all, and to anyone who's joining us today on Zoom as well. It's good to be back up here with you all again. Now, a while back I did a biographical series on the early kings of Israel. Now, I'd like to go back and pick up that biographical series again, where we draw practical lessons from the great characters of the Bible, but this time go all the way back to the time of the patriarchs. So in the sermon today, we're going to explore the life of the father of the faithful, Abraham. Now, there's a lot to cover in Abraham's life, so this will be part one, and next time we'll explore the second half of his life in part two. Now, I think most of you should have a handout that I've prepared, so you don't have to worry too much about taking notes as we go along. Now, on the handout, there's a brief explanation of what happens in each chapter, along with lessons we'll draw out of his story, plus some other charts and information for your benefit there. Now, I do also have another handout that's on the literature table over there. It combines all the handouts of the sermons from my previous series on the geography of the Holy Land, which has maps and brief descriptions and Bible verses of all places profiled in that series. Now, given its size, I've only printed out about 14 black and white copies. So if anyone misses out on a copy and you'd like one, just let me know. Also, if anyone wants a colour digital copy of that handout, just let me know and your email address afterwards, and I can email you a copy of that. Now, the story of the patriarch Abraham is told to us in Genesis 11 through to Genesis 25. Now, the important chapters that deal with the promises that God gave to Abraham are firstly Genesis 12, where God tells Abraham to go to the land of Canaan and promises to make a great nation from him, which he repeats in the next chapter. Then in Genesis 15, God formalises the covenant with Abraham and promises him a son from his own body and the land from the Euphrates to Egypt. And in Genesis 17, God expands the promise, saying many nations shall not come just from him, but from Sarah, who will give birth to the promised son. Now, in that same chapter, circumcision is given as the sign of the covenant, and God changes his name and that of his wife to Abraham and Sarah. And then in Genesis 22, after Abraham was willing to offer Isaac, God reiterates the promise and adds the promise of his descendants possessing the gates of their enemies. So we're going to explore each of those things as we go further along. Now, Abraham is introduced to us in Genesis 11 as a son of the 10th generation after Noah's flood. Now, he is born around about 1950 BC as one of three sons of Terah. Now, going backwards, Eber, who was of the 4th generation after Noah, is where we get the name for the Hebrews from, which means to cross over. Now, Eber's son Peleg was given that name because of the division that occurred during his life, which is probably a reference to the scattering that occurred at the Tower of Babel. Now, according to the figures given in Genesis, Noah, who lived to the grand old age of 950 years old, and he actually died about 2 years short of when Abraham himself was born. Now, Noah's son Shem, who according to legend was a righteous servant of God, lived for about 600 years, and he died around 1800 BC. So Shem was not only alive when Abraham moved to Canaan, but lived until Isaac was 50 years old, dying only a mere 10 years before the birth of Jacob. Now, Abraham's grandfather and one of Abraham's brothers both had the same name, that of Nahor. Now, this name probably has the funniest meaning of any name in the Bible, as the name Nahor means snorer. Now, here's a diagram showing Abraham's family tree. This should be on your handout as well. Now, Abraham's father Terah had three sons, Haran, Nahor, and Abraham. Now, we know that Terah had two wives because Sarah was Abraham's half-sister. And in Genesis 17, it notes that when Isaac was born, that Sarah was 90 years old, and that Abraham was 100 years old. So we know that Abraham is about 10 years older than his wife, who's also his half-sister. Now, up until Genesis 17, when God changes their names, Abraham and Sarah are referred to as Abram and Sarai. Speaking of which, nice to see you there, Sarah. Back then. Now, Haran is evidently the oldest of the sons of Terah. Now, his son is Abraham's nephew Lot. Now, Haran also has two daughters, Milcah and Iscah. And Abraham's older brother Nahor is actually married to his niece Milcah, the daughter of his brother Haran. So it's starting to get a bit complicated here, as we're seeing. Now, the first two sons of Nahor and Milcah were called Huz and Buz, which are names that make me giggle every time I hear them. Now, another of their sons was Bethuel, who was the father of Rebekah, who became Isaac's wife, as well as Laban, whose two daughters will later marry Jacob. Now, in addition to Abraham's sons of Isaac and Ishmael, Abraham remarries in his old age after Sarah dies, and through a second wife, Keturah, he has, would you believe, another 6 sons. Now, marrying one's half-sister and one's niece would later become prohibited at the time of the Exodus. Now, prior to that, children from such unions did not pose the same level of genetic risk as they would later on, as genetic degradation began to compound. Now, some critics have claimed that Genesis was not written until the 10th century BC or even later. Now, we know that Abraham was married to his half-sister, and Jacob would later marry Leah and Rachel, who were both his cousins. Now, this situation where such close relations would marry later would be prohibited in the statutes that Moses received at Mount Sinai. Now, if these stories were made up in the 10th century or even later, when some critics of the Bible say Genesis was written, they wouldn't have written about siblings or cousins marrying each other. Now, additionally, other customs were either prohibited or different later on in the time of Israel's kings, like the inheritance customs in Abraham's story and the giving of handmaids to become a surrogate mother if a wife is barren, where the children would become the legal child of the wife. Now, in Genesis 11, starting in verse 26, we read that Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now, Abram, the original name of Abraham, is placed first, making it appear that Terah was 70 years old when he begot Abraham. Now, a few chapters earlier, Shem is also listed first in the list of sons through Genesis 21. Though Genesis 21 plainly states that Japheth was the oldest. So we see here that being listed first does not necessarily mean that they're the firstborn, but is a means of giving one the preeminence in these cases. Now, in Genesis 12:4 it says that Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran. Now, if Abraham was the firstborn when Terah was 70 years old, then Abraham would have been 135 years old when Terah died at age 205 in Haran. Now, in Genesis 12:1, God tells Abraham to get out from his father's house, which implies that Terah was still alive when Abraham left Haran. Now, this is how the Jews interpreted, believing that Abram was the firstborn and that Terah died 60 years after Abraham left Haran. It was only in the New Testament in Acts 7:4 where we find confirmation Abraham only left Haran after his father's death. Now, according to Jewish chronology, our year, 2024, is year 5784 since Adam was created. Now, they believe there's over 200 years to go before 6,000 years is clocked up from creation. Now, this 200-year difference, compared to what we believe, comes from a combination of those extra 60 years here with Abraham and their very strange compression of the length of the Persian Empire from around 200 years down to just over 50 years in length. Now notice a couple of details here in relation to Terah moving his clan out of Ur of the Chaldees. Now he takes Haran's son Lot as well as Abraham, but he does not take Nahor to the city of Haran. So why didn't Terah take Nahor with him? We're not told why. Now perhaps he snored too much. Now the second detail to notice here is that when Terah moves the clan to Haran, he intends to go to the land of Canaan. Now Haran, where he dies, is not his intended final destination. Was he going there because he followed God and was told by God to go there? And we're not told, but that is one possibility. Now in Genesis 24:2 it states that Terah served other gods, yet Genesis 31:53 strongly implies that the God of Terah was the same God of Abraham when Laban tells Jacob, the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of their father, who was Terah, judged between us. Now there seems that there was a degree of mixed worship of both the true God and other gods in the family of Terah. And we know that Abraham was solely devoted to the true God, at least from the time he was in Haran, left Haran. Now we find though that the mixed worship continued in the family of Nahor. Now when Jacob flees from Nahor's grandson Laban, it says in Genesis 31:34 that Rachel took the household idols with her. And in Genesis 35:2 we read of Jacob commanding those in his household, who included many from Laban's family, to put away their foreign gods. Now the way that Terah allowed such mixed worship into his family is a good indication that he had little contact with Noah, who died shortly before Abraham was born, or with Noah's son Shem. Now legendary evidence indicates Noah late in his life was based mostly in southern Europe, where Shem was also after dealing with Nimrod, as possibly told in the Egyptian myth of Seth's defeat of Osiris. Now Abraham's Ur is most often identified with the famous Ur that British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated in the 1930s in southern Babylon, despite how far away it is from Haran, where they stayed for a time before moving on to the land of Canaan. Now is this where the Ur of the Chaldees was, or was it in a different location closer to Haran? Now there are a couple of reasons why the southern Ur in Babylonia is usually identified with Ur of the Chaldees. The Babylonian Empire was also known as the Chaldean Empire, and in Daniel and Esther, Nebuchadnezzar and many of his court officials are referred to as Chaldean, similar to the name Chaldees. Now the second reason is because of the fame of this particular site after British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated some fabulous treasures at the southern Ur in Babylon in the 1930s. Now the other main contender for Ur of the Chaldees is a town that is today called Sanal-Lurfa, but in ancient times was also known as Urfa and Edessa. Now this Urfa is a little way northwest of Haran, where Terah died. Now it's near the border of Turkey and Syria, where there's been some recent fighting between the Turks and the Kurds. Now there is a cave under Urfa's citadel that local legend says is Abraham's birthplace. Now Joshua 21:2 tells us that Abraham's family dwelt on the other side of the river, which is believed to mean the river Euphrates, though it could refer to the Jordan River as well. Now that southern Ur that Woolley excavated is on the same side of the Euphrates as the land of Israel, unlike Urfa, which is on the opposite side of the Euphrates River. Now this Urfa is close to other towns which have names close to names of members of Abraham's family, such as Tilterah, Surik, and Haran. Now Sina, like Shinar, is another nearby town. And many nearby places include the name Kale in them, which is similar to Chaldean or Chaldees. Now the Chaldees, spelled Khaldis, was the name for the pantheon of gods of the Hurrians who lived in southeast Turkey close to Mount Ararat, and is the likely derivation for the name Chaldees. Now remember before how we saw that Nahor stayed behind at Ur of the Chaldees and didn't go with Terah and Abraham to Haran. Now in Genesis 24, Abraham tells his servant to go back to my country, and so he went to Mesopotamia to the city of Nahor. Now Nahor is no longer alive at this time. Now his servant meets his son Bethuel and grandson Laban of Paddan Aram in Syria. Now later, when Jacob has to flee from Esau, he goes to Laban, who we are told is in Haran. Now assuming Laban hasn't moved location, this city of Nahor that Abraham's servant went to was definitely Haran. So from these verses, we have to deduce that sometime after Terah left for Haran, that Nahor also went to Haran. Now the most logical reason would be when you heard the news that Terah was close to dying or had just died. Now coming down to Genesis 24:4, Abraham said that where Nahor's family was, that is Haran, was my country. So why would he call Haran my country if Ur, where he originally came from, was all the way down in southern Babylonia? Now this is probably the strongest support for the northern Ur being the Ur that Abraham came from. Now in Genesis 12:4 it says that Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran to go to the land of Canaan. Now in Hebrews 11:8 it says that Abraham faithfully obeyed God to make this big move, and then he went out not knowing where he was going. Now this was a gutsy, courageous thing to leave the place where he was comfortable with and obey God not knowing where he was going. Now this brings us to the first lesson that we can learn from Abraham's life. Have the courage to leave what is comfortable and follow God even when you are not sure where doing it God's way will take you. Now this might include moving to a new place, or coming to church for the first time, or breaking off a relationship that's pulling you away from God. Now there are many things that God calls us to do that take courage and moving out of our comfort zone. Now after the flood, the earth's inhabitants once again began to turn their back on God. Now by Abraham's time, all peoples had again grown corrupt. Now a booklet, The United States and Britain in Bible Prophecy, tells us the following. God then set in motion a major aspect of his plan to offer salvation to mankind. Selecting Abraham was a crucial step in God's long-term plan to turn all nations back to him. The remainder of the Bible is woven around his plan to reconcile all humanity to himself. Now let this next paragraph really sink in. Now God chose Abraham and promised to develop his descendants into a group of influential nations chosen for the purpose of teaching and illustrating his values and way of life to the rest of the world. End of quote. Now God wanted his people to be a light on a hill to draw and attract the Gentiles, rather than being an exclusivist religious system just for Israel that the Gentiles could not be a part of. Now the purpose of the Abrahamic covenant is outlined 3 times in the book of Genesis. In Genesis 12:3 we read, "And I will bless those that bless you, and curse the one who curses you. And it says, "And in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Now in Genesis 22:18 we read, "And in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." And in Genesis 28:14 we read, "And your seed shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. And in you and in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Now it was God's intention that all the nations of the world be blessed by what he was going to do through the nations descended from Abraham. Now God was going to use both Abraham and his seed, the nation of Israel, to bless all nations of the world through the example that they were to set as a model nation to help and bless other nations, something that won't reach its major fulfillment until after the return of Jesus Christ. Now Jesus Christ was a descendant of Abraham, and he was also a seed of Abraham whose sacrifice would open up salvation and entrance into God's kingdom that Paul spoke about in Galatians 3:16. Now, just as an aside, notice the cardinal directions in Genesis 28:14: west, east, north, and south. Now, those directions just happen to correspond with the chronological order of expansion of the British Empire: west to America and the Caribbean, east to India, then north into Canada, and then south into Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Now, there's been a rather persistent myth that has continued to be perpetuated that the slavery of the Israelites lasted some 400 years. Now, this is based on a misunderstanding of Exodus 12:40 that says that the sojourning of Israel was 430 years. Now, Paul says in Galatians 3:16 and 17 that from Abraham, when the promises were made, till Mount Sinai and the giving of the law, was that same period of time, 430 years. Now, Josephus further explains that the 430 years was from when Abraham came into Canaan till the Exodus, and that from Jacob moving to Egypt till the Exodus was exactly half that period, 215 years. Now, the use of that phrase, the self-same day, in Exodus 12:40, indicates that Abraham left for the land of Canaan on the same day as the Israelites left Egypt, the first day of unleavened bread. Now, this is quite fitting, as this fits the typology of us coming out of sin. Now, the first place that Abraham stops at in the land of Canaan is Shechem in the Central Highlands, where the Israelites would later confirm the covenant by reciting the blessings and cursings with half of the tribes on Mount Gerizim and the other half on Mount Ebal. Now at Shechem in Genesis 12:7 it says that the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your descendants I will give this land. Now the Canaanites who had settled the land prior to Abraham, in God's eyes, only had a temporary lease on the land until the time that Israel would inherit the land. Now the Canaanites descended from Ham's son Canaan. Now the descendants of his brothers Cush and Put are believed to be the ancestors of the black African peoples, while his brother Mizraim is believed to be the ancestor of the Egyptians. Now, based on Egyptian paintings, it appears that the Canaanite tribes were olive to brown skinned. Now, it says here that the Lord visibly appeared to Abraham when he gave him the first promise of a land that he is passing through. Now, here at Shechem, Abraham builds an altar, and then the next place he goes to is Bethel, just north of Jerusalem on the ridge route, where he builds another altar. Now, not long into his stay in the land, there is a terrible famine, so he then goes down to Egypt to get food. Now, when the Lord appeared to Abraham at Shechem and promised him the land, this was not the first time that he had visibly appeared to him. Now, Stephen, in his address in Acts 7, says the following: "Brethren and fathers, listen, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, 'Get out of your country and from your relatives and come to a land that I will show you.' Now, he will visibly appear to him at least 2 more times in person in Genesis 17 and Genesis 18. Now, there are other times that the Lord will speak to Abraham, but there's not enough information to determine if it is just a voice he hears, or he also sees the Lord again visibly. Now, he also sees the Lord in Genesis 15, but on that occasion we know it's a vision. Now, God would also visibly appear to his son Isaac twice, that is given to us in Genesis 26. And to Jacob, he appeared to him in a vision at Bethel on his way to Haran, then wrestled with him at Penuel, and then appeared to him again at Bethel after he'd returned from Haran. Now, on his way to Egypt, Abraham starts worrying about the possibility of the Pharaoh wanting to take his wife to himself because she is so good looking. Now, just bear in mind that Sarah is about 65 years old at this time. Now, he fears Pharaoh may even kill him in order to take his wife, so he concocts a plan to tell a half-truth out of fear to protect himself. They will only say that Sarah is his sister, but not his wife. Now, Abraham is mingling with Pharaoh's court, and his courtiers point out Sarah's beauty to the Pharaoh, who is immediately taken by her beauty and takes her into his palace and treats Abraham well because of her. Now, God will later intervene and send plagues on the Pharaoh and his court, who then find out that Sarah is also Abraham's wife. Now, Pharaoh is rightfully upset with him, gives Sarah back to him, and sends him on his way back to Canaan. Now, it is likely here in Egypt that they pick up Sarah's handmaid, Hagar. Now, some 25 years later, we actually find Abraham making exactly the same mistake. In Genesis 20, in the months between the destruction of Sodom and when Sarah conceives Isaac, Abraham is dwelling in Gerar in the southwest of Israel. Now, rather than trusting God to protect him, of which he had evidence for in Egypt, he again let his fear get the better of him, telling that same half-truth that Sarah is only his sister. Now, like Pharaoh, Abimelech is so taken with Sarah's beauty, even though at that point she is actually 90 years old, would you believe, and he takes her into his harem. Now, she must have been quite some stunning-looking woman to have that sort of effect on those men. Now, God would again get Abraham out of the mess his fear has created by warning Abimelech in a dream not to take Sarah as his wife. Abimelech, like Pharaoh, got rightfully upset with Abraham and restores Sarah back to him. Now, who was the Pharaoh that Abraham interacted with when he was in Egypt? Now, according to French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer, there was a great catastrophe that brought an end to the early Bronze Age right across the entire Middle East. Now, when we look at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in part 2, we'll look at why I believe this event is probably best dated to this same time at the end of the early Bronze Age, when there was a great catastrophe felt across the entire Middle East. Now, based on that, in the palace of Naram Sin that was destroyed at that particular time was an alabaster found of this pharaoh here, Pepi I, from the early 6th dynasty. Now, if this dynasty was contemporary with the time of Abraham, this pharaoh may have been the one that Abraham interacted with in Genesis 12. Now, after his return to the land of Canaan, we read in Genesis 13, verses 7 to 9. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle. And the Canaanite and the Perizzite lived then in the land. And Abraham said to Lot, "Let there be no strife, I pray, between me and you, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are men. Brothers, is not the whole land before you? I pray you, separate yourself from me. If you go to the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, I will then go to the left. Now this brings us to the second lesson that we can learn from Abraham's life. Humility and deference to the needs of others is vital to living at peace with other people. Now sometimes we need to have the humility to let the other person have their way, as Abraham did with his nephew Lot, even though as patriarch of the household, Abraham had the right to have his way. Now a little humility and less insistence of what we want can go a very long way to resolving problems that we have with other people. Yes, there are some points of morality that we should not compromise on, but with everything else, such as our day-to-day desires and wants, we should be flexible and willing to compromise. Now, immediately before his instructions to husbands and wife, Paul says in Ephesians 5:21 that we should submit ourselves to one another. In other words, be willing to defer to what others want and need, rather than insisting on our own way all the time. Now, Abraham's nephew Lot would later settle in Sodom and appears to be an elder of the city, rendering judgment in the gate, according to Genesis 13:12. Now, the valley of Siddim, where there were several cities, including Sodom and Gomorrah, is equated with the Salt or Dead Sea in Genesis 14:3. Now, the expression that is the Salt Sea is likely an editorial note that was added in much later to let readers know where these cities that God destroyed were located. Now, these cities may have been along the shore of the Dead Sea, or it is even possible that the Dead Sea may not have even been in existence yet in the days of Abraham before Sodom was destroyed. Now, Genesis 14:4 says that the area around Sodom had been under tribute for 12 years to the kings over Mesopotamia, but the locals around the Dead Sea have decided to rebel against paying that annual tribute. Now, in retaliation, an alliance of 4 kings from the east come to pillage that area, and in the process, Lot is captured. Now, as they head back to Mesopotamia, Abraham hears about it and courageously goes after them and to rescue Lot and the others with 318 trained servants that were born in his house. Now, between Dan and further north towards Damascus, during their daring night raid, he rescues them all and all the goods that were plundered. Now, Genesis 14 tells us that the names of the kings were Amraphel, king of Shinar. Now, Shinar is another name for Mesopotamia. The next king is Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, which is in today's Iran. Then Arioch, king of Elasar, which may be the Mesopotamian city of Lasol, alternatively Ashur. And the last king is Tidhal, king of Goim. Now, Goim is the Hebrew word for nations or Gentiles, so these kings ruled a very large part of Mesopotamia and beyond, and they would have had quite a strong army. Now, amongst tablets in the Spartali collection, there is mention of an alliance between the king of Elam, Kedorlaomer, who led an alliance of rulers that included one named Eriaku and another named Dagulha. Names which are quite similar to 3 of the 4 kings listed in Genesis 14. Now, after the victory, the king of Sodom goes to meet Abraham to see the people that Abraham has rescued from his town. Now, the location is noted as the King's Valley, which Josephus places in the Kidron Valley near Jerusalem. Now, Abraham is then greeted by a mysterious person known as Melchizedek, who is identified as the king of Salem and priest of God Most High. Now, in his discussion on tithing in Hebrews 7, the Apostle Paul mentions that the kings of the east were slaughtered in Abraham's raid on them. And Abraham then tithed on the spoils minus the goods that were captured from the cities of the plain. Now, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and Salem means peace. So fully translated, Paul says that his name is king of righteousness, king of priests, priest of the Most High God, and that he has no beginning of days nor end of life. In other words, it seems to be that this priest was an eternal being. Now, in the church today, we teach that this Melchizedek was another appearance of the Lord who later became Jesus Christ. Now, did he actually rule over a city of people where Jerusalem is today in Abraham's time? Now, the earliest confirmed archaeological remains in Jerusalem only go back as far as the Middle Bronze Age, not to the early Bronze Age when Abraham lived. Now, there may have been a city there in Abraham's time, as this meeting occurred in the Kidron Valley right next to Jerusalem. Or alternatively, King of Salem may have just been a title as implied in Paul's writing. An interesting question is, what did Melchizedek do with the tithe of the spoils if this was just another brief manifestation of the Lord? Now, we're not told in the account. Perhaps his angels distributed the tithe to the poor in the area. Now, the information about Share now comes from the excellent Ambassador College lecture series by Richard Page on ancient Israel. Now, it is usually assumed that the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, were just shepherds or herders of livestock. Now, if they were just shepherds, the following passage in Genesis 46 would seem somewhat out of place. Now, Joseph is getting ready for his family to move down to Egypt, and then he says to his brothers, if the Pharaoh asks you what your occupation is, I want you to tell him that you tend livestock. He then says that shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. Now, if they were just shepherds or herders of livestock, why would Joseph feel the need to prep his brothers and father to give this particular answer? Now, it would seem that they were more than just herders of livestock. Now, Joseph tells them to focus just on this one part of your overall business so that the Pharaoh will give you the land of Goshen. Now, we get a glimpse into their primary business in Genesis 34. Now, one of the men of Shechem has slept with Jacob's daughter Dinah, despite them not being married. Now, he goes to his father to arrange with Jacob for Dinah's hand in marriage. Now, his father then says to Jacob, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him as a wife, and make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters to yourselves. So they want the two to commingle and become one tribe. And he says, so you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. And then he says, dwell and trade in it, and acquire possessions for yourselves in it. So it was seen that the patriarch's main business was as a mercantile trader of goods. Now, this would explain a few things in the accounts of the lives of Abraham and Jacob. Now, if Abraham was a mercantile trader of goods, this would explain why he would have as many as 318 armed servants to protect his caravan of goods that he was selling. It would explain why Abraham was mingling close enough to the Pharaoh for Sarah to have been noticed by Pharaoh's court, given their attitude towards shepherds. Now, if they were just shepherds, they wouldn't have mingled in such high society in Egypt. Now, it would also explain why Abraham was called a mighty prince by the men of Hebron in Genesis 23:6, and why he mostly was based close to the cities on the ridge route. And of course, it would also explain why Joseph prepped his father and brothers to concentrate on just the shepherding part of their overall trade business in order to dwell in the land of Goshen. Now, the main locations that Abraham and Jacob are moving between also gives strong support to the patriarchs' main business being as mercantile traders of various goods. So the idea is that they would purchase these goods from the main caravans that travel between Egypt and Mesopotamia on the Via Maris or the King's Highway, and then they were sold. Then Abraham would sell them to the retailers in the towns throughout the land of Israel. Now, the Via Maris here is noted as the coastal highway. Now, on the other side of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea was the King's Highway. Now, running in between them in the central highlands is the road known as the Bridge Route, or the road or way of the patriarchs. Now, along that particular road, there are 4 key towns in the central highlands where Abraham and Jacob travelled between: Shechem and Bethel in the north, and Hebron and Beersheba in the south. Now, all 4 of these towns are on the Bridge Route, where there are crossroads shown in black here between the Via Maris and the King's Highway. Now, in Genesis 20 verse 1 it says, "And Abraham journeyed from there to the south and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur and stayed in Gerar." So in this particular occasion, Abraham goes way south of Beersheba on the way to Egypt before heading back to Gerar. Now, for what purpose might he do this particular trip? Well, perhaps he was trying to get the jump on the other traders doing business with the caravans that were just coming out of Egypt. Now, Gerar, where Abraham interacted with the Philistines, there was ruled by Abimelech, and it's on the road between Beersheba and Gaza, where there was plenty of water and grazing for their herds. Now, in Genesis 13, after Abraham and Lot separated, God reiterated his promise that his descendants would become a great nation, and that both Abraham and his descendants would inherit the land forever. Now, since Abraham died without inheriting the promises, as it says in Hebrews 11:13, this implies a future resurrection and eternal life to be able to inherit it forever. Now, a couple of chapters later, in Genesis 15, God appears to Abraham in a vision approximately 10 years after he has come into the land. Now, Abraham asks, how can the promise of a great nation from him be fulfilled, since he has no children, and that his heir is his servant Eliezer? Now, the fact that Eliezer, a servant, is his heir and not his nephew Lot, who is not too far away in the land, is intriguing, but it is consistent with the customs of the time. A servant could be adopted and be considered part of the family, even more than a blood relative who is in the land, but not directly under the authority of the patriarch. Now, God tells Abraham that a son from his own body would become his heir. Now, God then, in this vision, then tells Abraham to look towards the heavens and says that your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. And Abraham trusts God that he will bring it to pass, despite the fact that he's now about 85 years old. Now then, God formalises the covenant with a common covenant ritual from this time, where they would cut up several animals in half, and God symbolically walked through those cut pieces. Now, by walking through the cut animals, the covenant maker was essentially saying, let what happened to these animals happen to me if I did not fulfill my part of the covenant. Now, God promises Abraham's descendants that they would inherit all the land from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. Now, the river or brook of Egypt here is not the Nile, but the Wadi El Arish that bisects the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, notice also it is to Abraham's descendants that this land will go to, not just Jacob's descendants who later became the nation Israel. Now, Abraham had other descendants who were not Israelites, such as Esau's descendants and Ishmael's descendants, who inherited the whole Saudi Arabian peninsula, which is technically between the river of Egypt and the Euphrates. Now God has promised Abraham a son. Now the details of Sarah being the mother of this child, which God has promised, has not been specifically mentioned yet. Now Sarah, who's around about 75 years old, is barren. Now she has an Egyptian maidservant, Hagar. Now in the customs of the day, if a woman was barren, she could provide a surrogate woman from her servants, and any child from this arrangement would legally be the child of the barren woman. Now this is why Sarah says, perhaps I shall obtain children by her. Now rather than confirm with God if such an arrangement was what God had in mind, Sarah took matters into her own hands and convinced Abraham to go through with it. Now Hagar conceives and soon thereafter starts looking down on Sarah, knowing she is going to bear a child, unlike Sarah. Now Sarah responds harshly in return, and Hagar flees. And then an angel of God persuades her to go back, and then she goes back to them and she gives birth to Ishmael. Now Abraham is 86 when Ishmael is born. Now some 15 or so years later, in chapter 21, when Isaac is born, Abraham holds a feast after Isaac is weaned. Now Sarah overhears Ishmael scoffing in derision, probably because he's not the centre of attention. Now Sarah snaps and asks Abraham to cast out Hagar and Ishmael. Now Abraham is reluctant to do so because he loves Ishmael, but God tells him to let Sarah have her way in this matter, and he would look after Ishmael after they leave Abraham. Now after Hagar and Ishmael depart, God promises Hagar that he would make a great nation from Ishmael. Now the descendants of Ishmael became the people that we know today as the Arabs. Now the promise of a great nation was fulfilled in the time from the 600s AD on, when the Arab Empire expanded to a size even greater than the Roman Empire. So, if Ishmael becoming a great nation meant an empire larger in area than the Roman Empire, then how much greater are the birthright promises that God promised would come through Isaac's descendants? Now, Ishmael's descendants have felt that the birthright promises belong to them, and fed by their new religion of Islam, have often been the main enemies in conflict with Israel. Now, what would have happened if Sarah and Abraham had simply waited for God to provide the solution and not taken matters into their own hand? Perhaps generations of strife that we see play out on our TV sets today could have been avoided. The geopolitical scene in the Middle East today might be very different, with the ever-present threat of war being much diminished. Now this leads us to a third lesson from Abraham's life. Compromises lead to inferior results and should be avoided. Now we see this in the matter of Hagar and Ishmael, and also in Abraham's half-truth about Sarah. Now we saw the jealousy that occurred between Hagar and Ishmael towards Sarah and Isaac, and Sarah towards Hagar and Ishmael. Now in the matter of the half-truth about Sarah being his sister, Abraham may have saved his skin, but in both cases he almost lost his wife twice. Now the only thing that prevented it happening was God's intervention and God's desire to fulfill the promises through Sarah. So the lesson for us today is, let us be truthful at all times and not compromise with God's law. Now if we fail to do so, we might have some short-term benefits, but the results in the long run will be much inferior, just like in Abraham's life with the compromises that he made in two areas of his life. Now on that note, that concludes part one of this look into the life of Abraham. Now in part 2, when I'll be up here next month, we'll look at the remainder of Abraham's life and draw out further lessons that we can learn from the life of the father of the faithful.